This short video will examine 5 principles which guided the early Church Fathers in their interpretation of the Gospels and the historicity or otherwise of the events described within them, with the cleansing of the temple primarily in mind. The reason for this is that quite often in commentaries today on the cleansing of the temple, the historical features described in the Gospels by the evangelists tend to be downgraded or even denied. Although the Church Fathers sought out and emphasized the spiritual meaning of this event, it will nevertheless be seen that with regard to the literal historical features described in the Gospels by the evangelists, they viewed Jesus' actions in the holy place as a catastrophic event of great magnitude. This understanding is evident in all their writings. In fact, with the exception of Origen, they viewed 2 distinct actions as having taken place. In another video entitled The Early Church Fathers and the Cleansing of the Temple, their writings will be examined in this regard. This literal historical understanding flowed naturally as a consequence of certain principles that guided their interpretation of the Gospels. These principles, some of which are assumptions they made concerning the Gospels themselves, will now be examined, for it is proposed, without an appreciation of such principles, noting in particular their belief in the complete inerrancy of Scripture, their writings might uncritically be regarded as overly simplistic and naive with respect to their literal interpretation of events described. The first 3 of these 5 principles are external and will look at how the early Church Fathers viewed the Gospels from outside. It will investigate certain broad assumptions they held concerning A. Authorship of the Gospels, B. Which was the first Gospel written, and C. Their date of composition. The 4th and 5th principles are internal, dealing with the Gospel texts themselves, and relate to D. the doctrine of biblical inerrancy, and E. the harmonization of the Gospels. These 5 principles held by the Church Fathers are: 1. The 4 Gospels are trustworthy and reliable historical accounts, as they are all based on eyewitness testimony. 2. The Apostle Matthew wrote the first Gospel in the language of the Hebrews before it was finally composed in its present Greek canonical form. 3. The Synoptic Gospels were written before 70 AD. 4. As a consequence of the doctrine of biblical inerrancy and the extent to which it applies, the Gospels are completely inerrant with regard to what is described. 5. When studying any event in the life of Jesus which has been reported by more than one evangelist, the cleansing of the temple is one such example, which is in fact described by all 4 evangelists. The 4 Gospels should be examined together and harmonized. 1. Authorship. The Gospels were written by eyewitnesses and are based on apostolic testimony. From the writings of the early Church Fathers, it is clear that they believed the apostles Matthew and John wrote the Gospels attributed to their name, and that St. Mark's Gospel is firmly based upon the preaching of the Apostle Peter. Please use the pause button as citations from the Fathers' writings are provided on the screen. In the case of St. Luke's Gospel, the Fathers were well aware of what St. Luke himself taught in his Gospel, namely that he had derived his information of the things which have been accomplished among us from those who had been, from the beginning, companions and eyewitnesses of the Word. For this and other reasons, they knew St. Luke's testimony was reliable. Please use the pause button. The influence of St. Paul's preaching in St. Luke's Gospel was also attested by St. Irenaeus and Eusebius. That the Gospels were written by eyewitnesses and have apostolic testimony is a very important point to establish for two reasons. 1. Eyewitnesses of the different events in Jesus' life, the cleansing of the temple being a notable example, would be more likely to give accurate accounts, especially as any inaccuracies could be challenged by other and often hostile eyewitnesses who were still alive when they were writing. 2. As the Gospels claimed for their authority the personal stamp of the apostles, there would have been less opportunity or freedom during the period of oral tradition, that is, that period of time when the Gospels circulated orally before they were finally written, to add to or delete, to reshape or edit, as is often suggested in recent scholarship, what would have been known and revered as apostolic and trustworthy accounts. 2. Which was the first Gospel written? St. Matthew was the first to write his Gospel in the language of the Hebrews. According to several of the early Church Fathers, St. Matthew was the first to write his Gospel in the language of the Hebrews. Please use the pause button as some citations from the Fathers' writings are shown on the screen. The canonical Gospel we have today is in Greek, but according to the Fathers' writings, Matthew's Gospel existed in this Hebraic form at an earlier stage. The date, however, for this earlier Gospel is not explicitly cited by the Fathers and may thus only be conjectured. Some scholars date it around 40 AD. This affirmation by the early Fathers of an earlier Gospel of Matthew in the language of the Hebrews, substantially the same as that of the canonical Greek, is important for the manner in which we interpret the cleansing of the temple for two reasons. 1. In what is generally known as the synoptic problem, the priority more recently given by scholars to St. Mark's Gospel on the grounds that it is thought to have been the first Gospel written may have to be revised, or at least St. Mark's Gospel must be seen as linked with an earlier form in Aramaic. The main reason given in support of the proposition that St. Mark's Gospel was the first to be written is that his work is shorter than that of the other synoptic Gospels, and it is considered more likely that the shortest Gospel would have preceded the others so closely related to it. It is interesting to note, however, that this shorter, longer principle does not apply to the cleansing of the temple, which is considerably longer and more detailed in St. Mark's account than that found in the other synoptics. Please use the pause button for a brief note on the synoptic question. 2. If St. Matthew wrote an earlier draft of his Gospel, possibly as early as 41 or 42 AD, and this Gospel was substantially the same as the later canonical Greek Gospel of Matthew, then the period of time usually assigned to the oral tradition would have to be considerably reduced, leaving less opportunity for the more recently proposed editorial alterations and/or additions, and would strengthen the conviction of many scholars today in recovering the historical Jesus. This second of the 5 principles which guided the early Church Fathers in their interpretation of the Gospels means that St. Matthew's Gospel not only influenced the other synoptic Gospels, but also the Gospel of St. John. Although it is true that the Gospel of St. John records very little of what St. Matthew and the other synoptics included in their Gospels, and might therefore appear not to have been so influenced, it is suggested that Eusebius and St. Jerome were quite correct when stating that St. John deliberately omitted much of what the synoptics wrote in order to avoid duplication. St. John decided to include important historical events which the other evangelists had omitted, especially those events in the public ministry of Jesus prior to the arrest of St. John the Baptist. It is in this sense of non-duplication that St. Matthew's earlier work is proposed to have influenced St. John. For what St. Matthew included, St. John excluded, or stated more positively, what Matthew excluded, John included. If this is the case, then the inclusion by St. John of another cleansing of the temple at the beginning of Jesus' ministry is very significant. It may in addition explain why the later cleansing of the temple in Holy Week found in the Synoptics is not recorded by St. John. 3. The third principle which guided the early church fathers. Dating of the Gospels. Were the Synoptic Gospels written before the destruction of the temple in 70 AD? It is proposed that the early church fathers believed that the Synoptic Gospels were written before the dramatic events of the destruction of the temple and the city of Jerusalem in 70 AD, but that the Gospel of St. John was written after these same events. Let us look at this point a little. There is no clear reference in the writings of the early fathers as to the exact date when the four Gospels were written. The precise time when they were composed is not mentioned. That they did not consider it relevant to record the date of composition is interesting in itself and may indicate an appreciation among the fathers that all four Gospels originate primarily with Jesus himself, with the events of his life, his teaching, his death, resurrection, and ascension into heaven, which, as a gospel, he handed on to his apostles. This gospel of Jesus would only later receive canonical form as the four Gospels when finally they came to be written. The date then of the Gospel is that of Jesus himself. The four canonical Gospels, therefore, although written at various later times and each with a particular purpose in mind, all in fact represent and reflect this earlier Gospel. Making the same point in more recent biblical terms, it might simply be stated that the Jesus of history is the Christ of faith. Please use the pause button. As such, it may be assumed that the early fathers held all four Gospels with parity of esteem when searching for the historical Jesus. For although some of the Gospels were written later than the others and with varying degrees of theological purpose in mind, the fathers believed they all originated with Christ, and Christ, according to the fathers, is the historical Jesus of the Gospels. Although, as already mentioned, the Church Fathers did not specify the exact time when the Gospels were written, it may be reasonably inferred from their writings that they believed all three Synoptic Gospels were written before 70 AD. That this is so is deduced from two features of the New Testament which they commented upon. A. The prophetic nature of the Olivet Discourse of Jesus. Please use the pause button. And B. The dating of the Acts of the Apostles. Please use the pause button again. The significance of a pre-70 AD dating of the Synoptic Gospels. The most probable pre-70 AD dating of the Synoptic Gospels by the early Church Fathers has one significant consequence for their reading of the Gospels and the cleansing of the temple. This point is simply that the Fathers would not have considered it possible that the passages in the Synoptic Gospels describing the cleansing of the temple, and any other passages relating to the temple in Jerusalem, particularly those elements in the prophecy of Jesus in the Olivet Discourse relating to the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, could have been influenced by the historical events surrounding the temple and the city of Jerusalem in the Roman-Jewish War of 66 to 70 AD. The reasons for this are many, but the main one emphasized here is simply that these events could not have colored the Gospels in any way, as the Synoptic Gospels were, according to the Fathers, written beforehand. In this regard, the commentaries of the early Church Fathers stand in considerable contrast with that of several scholars today who, proposing that the Synoptic Gospels were written after 70 AD, go on to suggest that the Gospels do not necessarily describe historical events in the time of Jesus, but are more like made-up reflections of the state of the Church at a time when the temple and the city were destroyed and therefore no longer existed. The Fathers, on the other hand, believed that what is written in the Gospels are records of what actually took place. On the screen is now shown, for revision purposes, the 5 principles which guided the early Church Fathers in their reading of the Gospels. The 4th and 5th principles, that is the doctrine of biblical inerrancy and the extent to which it applies, and the harmonization of the Gospels, which guided the early Fathers in their interpretation of the Gospels, are very significant, and it is proposed are among the main reasons for which their commentaries on the cleansing of the temple show such differences with that of commentaries offered in recent historical critical scholarship. These 2 principles are essential to an understanding of the Fathers' commentaries on the cleansing of the temple, especially with regard to the extent of historicity they believed are recorded in the various accounts described in the Gospels. The 5th principle they adopted, the harmonization of the Gospels, flowed as a consequence of the 4th, the teaching of biblical inerrancy, which, it is proposed, was the foundation upon which the Fathers built their entire exegesis. Let us look a little at the 4th principle, the doctrine of biblical inerrancy. A. The extent of biblical inerrancy, according to the early Fathers, is without limit. Please use the pause button for some further details. B. That biblical inerrancy knows no limits, as understood by the early Fathers, is upheld in all the councils of the Church. Again, please use the pause button for some further details. C. This principle of unlimited biblical inerrancy, held by the early Fathers, is not upheld by the majority of scholars today. Again, please use the pause button for some further detail. As stated earlier in another video entitled The Early Church Fathers and the Cleansing of the Temple, the actual commentaries made by the Fathers on this important event in the life of Jesus will be examined. The 5th and final principle adopted by the early Church Fathers, the harmonization of the Gospels. A. When studying the life of Jesus, the early Church Fathers did not confine their study to one Gospel alone, a practice adopted in more recent historical critical scholarship, but searched all 4 Gospels for a more complete picture. Again, please use the pause button for further detail. B. This principle of harmonization adopted by the early Church Fathers is particularly significant for the cleansing of the temple. Again, please use the pause button. In conclusion, the 5 principles outlined above, which the early Fathers brought to their reading of the Gospels, guided the manner and content of their interpretation. The Fathers believed that the Gospels, 1. were composed on the basis of apostolic and eyewitness testimony, 2. were not altered during the period of oral tradition, with the first Gospel of St. Matthew written quite early in, as the Fathers wrote, the language of the Hebrews, 3. were composed, with the exception of St. John, before the events surrounding the destruction of the Temple and Jerusalem in 70 AD, 4. are inerrant in their entirety in what they record, and 5. should be read in harmony together. Their interpretation of any event or discourse in the life of Jesus was thus moulded and guided accordingly.